thief." The word fell into the hush of the betrothal dinner, like a coin dropped on marble, and every candle along the table seemed to lean toward Rosamond Vale at once. She did not flinch. She had learned long ago that flinching was a kind of confession, and she had nothing to confess. The accusation had come from the head of the table, from the woman who was to have been her husband's mother, and it hung now in the warm air above the roast and the silver and the wine, waiting for someone to either lift it or let it crush the girl it had been aimed at. A name is not so easily taken. Rosamond told herself that, silently, the way she had told it to herself 100 times in colder rooms than this one, but she felt the weight of every stare settle on her shoulders, cold as river water, and she understood that whatever she had thought this night would be, it was now something else entirely. She was 23 years old. She had no mother and no father, and almost no money of her own, only a small inheritance held in trust, and a betrothal that had been meant to give her a place in the world at last, and in the space of one spoken word, all of it had begun to slide out from beneath her, like a floor giving way. The locket at her throat, her mother's locket, the one warm thing she still owned, felt suddenly heavy as a stone, and she did not understand yet that it was the very heart of the trap. She would understand soon. For the moment, she only sat, straight-backed, in the gown they had let her borrow, while the room decided whether she was a person or a verdict. The dinner had begun simply enough, as such evenings do, with nothing in the air but the ordinary tension of a family pretending to welcome a girl they did not want. Rosamond had dressed early, in the small, cold room at the top of the house that had been hers since her uncle took her in, and she had pinned her dark hair the way her mother had once shown her, and fastened the locket beneath the high lace collar of the borrowed silk. And she had looked at herself in the spotted glass, and tried to believe that this was the beginning of something kinder. She was an orphan of good blood, and no fortune, the daughter of a gentleman who had died with more debts than land, and she had spent 6 years in the house of her late father's brother as something between a relation and a servant. Never quite either, always at the edge of every room. The betrothal had been arranged, as these things were, by people who saw in it advantage for themselves. Mr. Edmund Price was a pleasant, soft-handed young man, with a comfortable estate, and a will that bent toward whoever spoke last. And his mother, Lady Hester Price, was a woman of narrow eyes, and a wide reputation for getting precisely what she wanted. To Rosamond the match had promised escape. To her uncle it had promised the quiet removal of a girl he had never warmed to. To Lady Hester it had promised, though Rosamond did not yet know it, something altogether different. She had walked down the great staircase that evening with her chin level and her hands still, into a dining room blazing with candles, where the long table was laid with the best plate, and the family sat ranged along it like a jury already half decided. There had been the small courtesies, the cool smiles, the questions that were not really questions. There had been Edmund, seated across from her, offering her a glance that was meant to be reassuring, and managed only to be apologetic. And there had been, at the head of the table, Lady Hester, watching her future daughter-in-law over the rim of a wineglass with the patient attention of a woman waiting for a clock to strike. Rosamond had felt the watching and had mistaken it for ordinary disdain. She was wrong. The first course came and went. The talk turned, as it always did in that house, to land and money and the doings of better families, and Rosamond spoke little and listened much, which was her habit and her armor. She had trained herself over the long, thin years of her dependence to want less than she was offered, and to expect less than she was promised, and so she sat among them and did not reach for more than the bread on her own plate. It was somewhere between the fish and the meat that Lady Hester set down her glass with a small, deliberate click, and the table, sensing a change in the weather, fell by degrees into quiet. "Before we drink to the happy couple," Lady Hester said, and her voice was smooth and pleasant and carried to every corner of the room. "I find I must raise a small matter, a painful matter. I had hoped to spare us all, but a thing has gone missing from this house, and I cannot in conscience let it pass." A faint murmur ran along the table. Edmund's fork paused above his plate. Rosamond felt the first thread of cold move through her, though she could not yet have said why. "A piece of jewelry," Lady Hester went on, "of great value and greater meaning. The price diamonds. The brooch that belonged to my late mother, that her mother wore before her. It was in my dressing case this afternoon. It is not there now." She let that settle. Then she turned her narrow eyes the length of the table and fixed them on Rosamond, and the whole room turned with her, like iron filings to a magnet. "And I am told," she said, gently, terribly, "that Miss Vale was seen in the upstairs passage this very afternoon, alone, near my rooms. There it was, not yet the word, but the shape of it, the noose of it." Rosamond's heart struck once, hard against her ribs, and then she made it be still. She set down her own fork without a sound. She looked at the woman at the head of the table, and she did not look away. "I was in the passage," she said quietly. "I went to fetch a shawl from my room. The day was cold." "Alone," said Lady Hester. "Yes," said Rosamond. "I am usually alone." It was the plain truth, and it landed in the silence with a small sad weight, and for the space of a breath she thought it might be enough, that the bare honesty of it might shame them back toward decency. But Lady Hester only smiled, the way a card player smiles when the trick falls as planned, and she lifted one hand, and a footman came forward, carrying something on a small silver tray, and Rosamond saw it, and understood at last the full architecture of the thing being done to her. On the tray lay the locket, her mother's locket, that had hung beneath her collar not an hour before, that she would have sworn was at her throat still. And yet here it was, presented like evidence, its thin gold chain coiled beside it like a snare. "This," said Lady Hester, "was found in Miss Vale's room. Caught, if you can believe it, in the lining of her traveling case." She paused. "Open it." The footman, a boy of perhaps 15 with a frightened white face, fumbled the small clasp. The locket opened, and inside, where Rosamond's mother's portrait should have been, where for 23 years there had been nothing but a faded little painting of a woman with Rosamond's own dark eyes, inside lay a single diamond, loose and gleaming, prized, anyone could see, from a larger setting, a stone from the price brooch. The room drew breath as one. Somewhere down the table, a woman gasped, and a man muttered, and the candle nearest Rosamond chose that moment to gutter and flare, throwing her shadow huge and trembling against the wall behind her. "There," said Lady Hester softly, and her satisfaction was a quiet, ladylike thing, almost gentle. "I had so hoped to be wrong." Now came the word. She did not even raise her voice to say it. She let it fall as lightly as the first one, into a silence so complete that it reached the farthest servant by the door. "Thief!" And the dinner Rosamond had hoped would be the beginning of her life became, in that instant, the public unmaking of it. She felt the verdict close over her. She saw Edmund's eyes drop to his plate and stay there. She saw her uncle's face go gray, not with anger on her behalf, but with calculation, already measuring what this would cost him. She saw the long table of strangers and near strangers arrange their features into the particular expression people wear when they have decided to believe the worst, because it is easier and more entertaining than belief in someone's goodness. And she understood that there was no one in this bright and crowded room who would stand for her. She was alone, as she had said. She was usually alone. So she did the only thing left to a person with nothing but her own straight back to defend her. She did not weep, and she did not plead, and she did not throw herself upon their mercy, because she had learned in colder rooms than this that mercy asked for is mercy denied. She rose from her chair. The movement was slow and certain, and it drew every eye. She stood among the candles in the borrowed gown with her chin level, and she looked at the locket on its silver tray, at the small stolen diamond glittering where her mother's face had been, and she spoke, and her voice did not shake. "That locket is mine," she said. "It held my mother's portrait. I do not know who put that stone inside it, or who took it from my throat to do so, but it was not I. I have stolen nothing in my life." A beat of silence. 1 second. 2 seconds. "A name is not so easily taken," she said. And it was then, into that ringing quiet, before Lady Hester could answer, before the table could close its verdict like a fist, that a chair scraped back at the far dim end of the room, the place where the least wanted guests were always seated, in the cold draught near the door, and a man rose to his feet, whom no one had expected to speak at all. He was tall. That was the first thing the room registered, the sheer unfolding height of him as he stood. And the second thing was the scar, the long pale seam that ran from his left temple down across his cheekbone, and lost itself in the dark of his jaw, the mark that had made nursemaids hush their children, and made mothers steer their daughters elsewhere, at every ball, for 10 years. Lord Aldous Marlowe, Viscount Greywater, the cold lord, the one no one dared to marry. He had come to the dinner because he held a portion of the late Mr. Vale's debt, and had been invited as a creditor is invited, grudgingly and to be flattered. And he had sat in his draught-cold corner all evening, saying nothing at all, watching the room the way a man watches deep water. Now he stood, and the candlelight found the hard planes of his face, and the whole table fell silent in a new way, a wary way, because whatever they thought of Rosamond Vale, they were frightened of him. "Madam," he said to Lady Hester, and his voice was low and even, and carried without effort, "you have made a serious charge. I should like to examine it." Lady Hester's smile did not falter, but something behind her eyes recalculated. "My lord, this is a family matter." "It is a matter of a young woman's life," he said, "conducted before 40 witnesses. That makes it mine, and theirs, and everyone's." He came down the length of the room without hurry, and the guests drew back their chairs to let him pass, and he stopped beside the silver tray, and looked down at the open locket and the single diamond, and did not touch it. "May I?" he said, and it was to Rosamond he spoke, not to the woman who had accused her, and the small courtesy of it, that he asked her, the thief, the disgraced girl, as though her permission still meant something, undid her composure more than all the cruelty had. She gave him the smallest nod. He lifted the locket. He turned it in his long fingers in the candlelight, and the scarred side of his face was toward the room, so that they all flinched a little, and he examined the loose stone, and the empty oval where a portrait had been, and the thin, worn gold of a thing carried close to the body for many years. "This locket," he said at last, "is old. The hinge is worn soft with handling. The gold has been polished thin where a thumb would rest. It has been loved a long time." He looked up. "The brooch from which this stone was taken. When did you last see it whole, madam?" "This afternoon," said Lady Hester. "In my case." "And the case was where?" "In my dressing room." "Locked?" A pause, very small. "I do not lock my own dressing room in my own house, my lord." "No," he said. "Of course not. So any person in this house might have entered it. A maid, a footman, a guest, the lady herself." His gaze moved, unhurried, to Edmund, to the uncle, back to Lady Hester, and the implication of it, mild and unspoken, sat down in the middle of the table like a guest no one had invited. "I make no charge," he said. "I observe only that a charge is easily made and not so easily proven. And I observe that a stone may be put inside a locket by any hand that holds the locket, and that the question of whose hand is not answered by the stone, but by the answer to one thing only: who carried this from her throat to that room?" Silence. He set the locket down, gently, beside the diamond, and then, Lord Aldous Marlowe did the thing that the room would speak of for a year afterward, the thing that turned the evening on its axis. He turned to Rosamond Vale, the disgraced, the friendless, the thief, and he inclined his scarred head to her as a man bows to a lady he respects, and he said, in that low, even voice that carried to every listening corner, "Miss Vale, if your betrothal is dissolved tonight, as I think it must be, for a house that names you a thief is no house for you to marry into, then I would have you know that there is another offer on this table, though it comes from a colder quarter. Mine. I will not press you. I will not have your answer tonight, nor this month, nor until you have had time and safety enough to give it freely. But the offer stands, and it stands whether you are believed or not. I do not need the room to believe you. I find that I do." And the cold lord no one dared to marry stood waiting, in the candlelight, for a girl the world had just called a thief to lift her eyes. She lifted them. The room had gone so quiet that Rosamond could hear the candles themselves, the small, wet sound of the flames, and somewhere the frightened breathing of the boy who had carried the tray. She looked at the tall, scarred man who had crossed the length of a hostile room to stand beside her, and for the space of a heartbeat she could not speak at all, because no one in 6 years had stood beside her, and the unfamiliarity of it was like stepping from cold into sudden warmth, almost painful. She did not say yes. She was too careful a creature for that, and too proud, and besides, she did not yet trust the warmth not to be another kind of trap. But she did not say no. She inclined her head to him as he had inclined his to her, one dignity answering another. And she said, "You are kind to a stranger, my lord. I will remember it." And that was all, and it was enough, and it was the second time that evening that a thing had shifted in the room that could never be shifted back. Lady Hester rose. Her composure was a marvel. Rosamond would think of it often afterward, the way the woman gathered the wreck of her scheme and made of it, in an instant, a graceful surrender. "The hour grows late," she said, "and the matter is plainly more vexed than I supposed. I withdraw the charge. For tonight, I will not have my son's house made a courtroom, but the betrothal," and here her eyes flicked to Edmund, and Edmund, soft Edmund, dropped his gaze and said nothing, and in his silence the engagement died. "The betrothal, I think, we must all agree, can hardly proceed under such a cloud." It was over. Cleanly, quietly, with no diamond returned, and no apology offered, and no name cleared. Rosamond Vale had come down the stairs a bride-to-be, and would go back up them, a ruined girl. And the only thing that had changed in the whole disastrous evening was that a man she did not know had said, before everyone, that he believed her. She gathered the locket from the tray herself. No one stopped her. She closed it over the empty oval and the loose stone both, and she felt the small, worn weight of it settle in her palm. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that whatever else was taken from her tonight, she would keep this, because it was hers, and because a name is not so easily taken. She walked the length of the room with her head high and the candles guttering in her wake, and at the door she passed Lord Aldous Marlowe, and neither of them spoke, but he watched her go, and she felt him watching, and it was not the way the others had watched. It was the first time in a long time that being seen had not felt like being judged. The carriage home was cold and silent. Her uncle sat across from her with his hat in his lap, and his face turned to the dark window, and he did not look at her, and when at last he spoke, it was not to comfort her, but to count the cost. "You understand what you have done," he said. "I have done nothing," said Rosamond. "It hardly matters now whether you did or didn't. The thing is said. The prices will tell it their way, and their way will be the way that is believed, because they have money, and you have a stain. No respectable house will take you now. Do you understand that? Not one." She understood it perfectly. She had understood it from the moment the word fell. She looked out at the black hedges streaming past, and the cold stars above them, and she let her uncle's words land where they would, because there was no use arguing with the truth of them. She had been ruined, efficiently and almost gently, by a woman who had smiled the whole time, and she did not yet know why. That was the thing that turned slowly in her mind through the long, cold drive, beneath the shock and the shame and the strange, small warmth of an unexpected ally. Why? Why go to such trouble? Why frame a penniless girl with no power to harm anyone? Why summon 40 witnesses? Why prize a diamond from an heirloom and hide it in a locket? Lady Hester had wanted the betrothal broken. That much was plain. But a betrothal could be broken with a word, with a manufactured slight, with nothing at all. One did not stage a public execution to be rid of a guest one might simply fail to invite again. There was more here. There was something Lady Hester wanted that the destruction of Rosamond Vale would buy her, and Rosamond, rocking in the cold dark of the carriage, with her mother's locket warm in her closed hand, set herself to learn what it was. She had endured a great deal in her life by enduring. But enduring, she was beginning to understand, was not the same as accepting, and there was a difference between bowing her head and offering her throat. Somewhere behind her, in a blazing dining room she would never enter again, the candles were being snuffed, one by one, and a tall, scarred man was making his cold courtesies and taking his leave. And somewhere ahead of her, in the dark, the truth of what had been done to her was waiting to be found. She did not know yet that it had been written down. She did not know yet that the woman who had ruined her had, like all careful people, kept an account. She knew only that her name had been taken, and that she meant, somehow, to take it back. The house she returned to that night had never been a home, and in the days that followed it, became less of one still. Word travels in the country the way damp travels through stone, slowly, and then all at once. And within a week, the story of the betrothal dinner had reached every drawing room within 20 miles, growing crueler and more certain with each telling. By the time it came back to Rosamond's own ears, through the careful unkindness of her uncle's wife, she had become in the public account a sly and grasping girl who had wormed her way into a good family and tried to rob it blind, caught only by the sharp eyes of a vigilant mother. No one mentioned that the diamond had been found in her own dead mother's locket. No one asked how a girl planning to rob a great house would hide her loot in the one object she could never deny was hers. The story did not need to make sense. It only needed to be told, and it was told everywhere. And Rosamond Vale, who had spent 6 years making herself small enough to be tolerated, now found that even her smallness was no longer tolerated. Her aunt by marriage, a thin, anxious woman much governed by what the neighbors thought, could scarcely look at her. Her uncle spoke to her only to remind her of the burden she had become. The servants, who had once treated her with the rough kindness reserved for someone only a little above themselves, now watched her sidelong, uncertain whether she was a wronged lady or a caught thief. And uncertainty, in servants, curdles quickly into suspicion. She took to her cold room at the top of the house and stayed there. And she did her mending and read her few books and waited for the world to decide what to do with her. And she did not weep, because she had learned long ago that tears were a currency no one in that house would honor. But she was not idle. Behind the still surface of her endurance, her mind had begun to work. She thought about the afternoon of the dinner, turning it over and over, the way one turns a stone to find the seam. She had gone up to her room for the shawl. That was true. The passage had been empty. That was true. She had worn the locket down to dinner. She was certain of it. She remembered the small, cold kiss of it against her collarbone as she fastened her collar. And yet the locket had ended on a silver tray with a stranger's diamond inside it, which meant that between the fastening of her collar and the falling of the word, someone had taken it from her. There were not so many moments when that could have happened. She had come down the stairs. She had stood in the hall. She had been embraced. Yes, there it was. The one moment of contact when Lady Hester herself had drawn her close in a cool counterfeit of welcome, and pressed a dry cheek to hers, and murmured something about a daughter she had always wanted. The embrace had lasted a heartbeat too long. Rosamond had thought nothing of it at the time. She had thought only that the woman's affection was as false as everything else about the evening. But now, in the cold of her room, she felt again the brush of those careful fingers at the back of her neck, at the clasp of the chain, and she understood with a sick certainty exactly when her name had been stolen. It had been done with an embrace. There was a kind of artistry to it that frightened her more than open cruelty would have. This was not the work of a woman acting in the heat of greed. This was a thing planned and rehearsed, the locket marked beforehand, the diamond prized loose in advance, the footman instructed, the witnesses assembled, the embrace timed to the breath. Lady Hester Price had built the whole machine of Rosamond's destruction in cold blood and set it running with a smile, and a person did not build such a machine without a reason that mattered to her very much. Rosamond kept returning to the question of why, and slowly, in the long, quiet hours, an answer began to take shape, and it had to do with money, because in that world, it nearly always did. She had a small inheritance. Everyone spoke of it as though it were nothing. A few £100 held in trust from her late father, hers to claim at her marriage or her 30th year, whichever came first. A trifle by the standards of the Prices. But Rosamond had begun to wonder whether it was so small after all, or whether she had been encouraged to believe it small by people who knew better. Her father had died with debts. She had been told that all her life. But she had also, once as a child, seen her father's solicitor bow to him in the street with a deference that did not match a man drowning in debt. And she had a memory, faint and golden, of a house larger than any she had lived in since, and of her mother's hands at this very locket, and of her mother saying, in the soft voice Rosamond could no longer quite hear, that there was something in it, worth more than diamonds, and that one day Rosamond would understand. She had been 7. She had not understood. She had carried the locket for 16 years since, and never found in it anything but the faded portrait, and she had let the world tell her she was poor, because the world had no reason to lie about so dull a thing. But the world, she was learning, lied about everything, and the people who profited from her poverty were exactly the people who had told her of it. The locket! She kept coming back to the locket. Lady Hester had gone to extraordinary trouble to put a stolen diamond inside this particular object. Not into Rosamond's reticule, not into the lining of a coat, but into the one thing Rosamond loved, the one thing she would carry to her grave. At first, Rosamond had read it as simple cruelty, a refinement of malice, the desire to poison even her last comfort. But now another reading occurred to her, colder and more frightening. What if the locket itself had been the point? What if Lady Hester had needed, for reasons of her own, to get her hands on this exact object, and the diamond and the accusation had been merely the means, a way to seize the locket in front of witnesses, to make its surrender seem natural, to ensure that when it was taken from Rosamond, no one would ever ask to give it back. But the footman had given it back. Or rather, Rosamond had taken it back, from the silver tray, in the confusion of the evening, while everyone's attention was fixed on the dying betrothal. Lady Hester had let the charge be withdrawn. She had not, in the chaos, secured the locket. And Rosamond, sitting alone in her cold room with the small, worn weight of it in her hand, began to feel that she held something far more dangerous than a keepsake, and that the woman who had ruined her had made, somewhere in her perfect scheme, one small mistake. She did not yet know what the locket held. She only knew that she had nearly lost it, and that its near loss had been the true aim of an evening, dressed as something else, and that careful people make their one mistake precisely where they are most careful. She turned the locket over and over in the candlelight, and she pressed the worn gold, and she did not find the catch that night, nor the next, but she had begun to look. Meanwhile, in a colder and grander house some miles distant, the man who had risen to defend her was thinking about her too, though he would not have admitted it to a living soul, least of all himself. Lord Aldous Marlowe had spent 10 years making himself unapproachable, and he had done it on purpose, and he had done it well. The scar across his face he had earned saving a child from a bolting carriage when he was 8 and 20, dragging the boy clear and taking the wheel's edge across his own cheek. But the world, which preferred a darker story, had decided over the years that he had got it in a duel, or a brawl, or some dishonor too disgraceful to name, and he had never troubled to correct them. It suited him to be feared. A feared man is left alone, and being left alone was the only peace Aldous Marlowe had found since the season, years before, when his own name had been quietly destroyed by people he had trusted, over a matter he had been too proud to defend himself against. He knew better than most what it was to be condemned in a bright room full of people who had decided the worst of you for their own convenience. He had recognized it in an instant, across the length of that dining table, the particular stillness of a person being unmade, the straight back, the refusal to weep. He had seen himself in her. That was the whole of it, he told himself. Simple fellow feeling, the recognition of a fellow casualty. It was not anything more. He had made the offer because it was just, and because the look of the locket and the obviousness of the frame had offended his sense of order, and because he could not in conscience watch a thing so plainly false be allowed to stand. That was all. That he could not stop thinking about the line she had spoken. A name is not so easily taken. Or the way she had inclined her head to him with the dignity of a queen accepting a courtesy, rather than a beggar accepting alms, was beside the point. He was 36 years old, and he had buried his capacity for hope a long time ago, in the same cold ground as his good name, and he did not intend to dig it up again for a girl he had met for an hour. And yet, he found himself, in the days that followed, making inquiries. Quietly, in the way of a man who has learned to do everything quietly. He asked his steward what was known of the late Mr. Vale, the heroine's father, the man whose debt had brought Aldous to that disastrous table in the first place. He read again the papers relating to that debt, which he had bought years ago from a syndicate dissolving its accounts, almost without noticing what he bought. And he found, as careful men often find when they look closely at what they thought they understood, that the story did not fit the figures. The late Mr. Vale had been called a ruined man, but the debt against his estate, the debt Aldous himself now held, was modest, easily covered, 100 times over, by the value of the lands the man had owned at his death, lands which had passed, on his death, not to his only child, but to his brother, the uncle in whose cold house the girl now lived as a poor relation. Aldous sat very still in his study, with a single lamp burning at his elbow and the papers spread before him, and he felt the first stirring of an anger he had thought himself long past. He was not a man given to fancies, but he had spent his life among documents and deeds and the quiet machinery by which property moved from hand to hand, and he knew the smell of a thing arranged. A wealthy man's only daughter told all her life that she was penniless. An estate that should have been hers passed instead to an uncle on the strength of debts that did not, when one troubled to add them, actually exist. And now, on the very eve of that daughter's marriage, the marriage that would have given her at last a husband to ask the questions she had never been taught to ask, a sudden, vicious, perfectly timed accusation that destroyed her standing and, not incidentally, voided the betrothal and severed her from the one person who might have looked into her affairs. It was, Aldous thought, a very great deal of trouble to take over a girl with nothing, unless the girl did not, in fact, have nothing, unless someone had worked very hard, for a very long time, to ensure that she believed she had nothing, and that everyone around her believed it too, and that the truth, whatever it was, stayed buried where it could do no harm. He looked at the lamp. He thought of the locket he had held in his hands at that table, old, worn soft, loved a long time, the gold polished thin where a thumb would rest, He thought of how the whole scheme had pivoted on that small object. How strange it was that a woman framing a girl for theft would hide the evidence in the one thing the girl could never be parted from. And a suspicion took shape in him that was almost the twin of the one taking shape, miles away, in Rosamond's own mind. He did not act on it at once. He was a careful man, and the careful do not move until they can see the ground. But he wrote a letter that night to a solicitor in London named Mr. Quill, an old and discreet man who had handled Aldous' own affairs through the worst years of his disgrace, and had never once spoken a word he should not. He asked Mr. Quill to look very quietly into the estate of the late Mr. Vale, into the deeds, the debts, the will, and most particularly into anything that might explain why an heiress had been raised as a pauper. He sealed the letter with the single lamp guttering low, and he sat a while longer in the dark afterward, and he told himself again that he was doing this only because it was just. He was not yet ready to admit that he was doing it because, for the first time in 10 cold years, he had met someone he could not stop thinking about, and that the thought of her sitting wronged and friendless in a house that hated her was a thing he found, to his own great inconvenience, that he could not bear. The first letter came 3 days later. It was not from London. It came by the ordinary post, addressed in an unfamiliar hand to Miss Rosamond Vale, and her aunt brought it up to her cold room with the particular sour curiosity of a woman who would have read it if she dared. Rosamond waited until she was alone to break the seal. Inside was a single sheet, and on it, in a strong, plain hand, with no flourish, were a very few lines. Miss Vale, I have not forgotten the matter of which we spoke. I do not expect you to have decided anything, nor do I write to press you. I write only to say that I have begun to look into a question that concerns you more nearly than you may know, and that when I have an answer, I will bring it to you myself, and you may do with it what you will. Until then, guard the locket. Tell no one you have it. Yours in respect, Greywater. Rosamond read it 3 times. Guard the locket. Tell no one you have it. So he had seen it too. The strange centrality of the small, worn thing. The way the whole evening had bent around it like light around a stone. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, with the letter in one hand and the locket in the other, and she felt, for the first time since the word had fallen, something that was not quite fear, and not quite hope, but had the shape of both. She was not, after all, entirely alone. There was a man, a frightening, scarred, much avoided man, who had looked at the same puzzle she was looking at, and seen the same wrongness in it, and who was, even now, somewhere in the cold spring countryside, pulling at the same buried thread. She did not write back at once. She was too cautious, and besides, she had nothing yet to tell him. But that night, by the stub of her last candle, she set herself in earnest to the locket. She had pressed, and turned, and examined it a dozen times without result. But she had been looking, she realized, in the obvious places. The clasp, the hinge, the rim. She had been looking for a catch a careless person would find. Her mother had not been a careless person. Her mother had said there was something in it worth more than diamonds, and her mother had been the sort of woman who would hide a thing well, or not at all. So Rosamond slowed herself. She held the locket close to the candle and warmed the gold in her fingers, and she ran the pad of her thumb very slowly over every surface, feeling for the smallest irregularity, the way a blind woman reads a face. And at last, on the inner rim of the empty oval, where the portrait had sat, where no eye would ever think to look, because the portrait had always covered it, her thumb found the faintest ridge, a hairline seam in the gold, no wider than a thread. She pressed it. Nothing. She pressed it and slid it once, and felt the smallest give, and the false back of the oval, for it was a false back, a second layer thin as paper, fitted with a craftsman's love, lifted a fraction on a hidden hinge. Rosamond's breath stopped in her throat. Beneath the false back, folded so many times it had worn soft at the creases, pressed flat by 16 years against a woman's heart, lay a paper. She drew it out with trembling fingers. The candle guttered. She shielded it with her hand and bent close. The paper was thin and yellowed and covered in a fine slanting hand she had not seen since she was a child, but knew at once, knew in her marrow, the way one knows a parent's writing. Her father's hand. And what it said, in the careful words of a man writing for a future he would not see, changed everything Rosamond Vale thought she knew about her own life. It was not the whole truth. She would not have the whole truth for some weeks yet, and it would cost a great deal to get. But it was the thread's end, the loose corner of the great concealment, and her father had pressed it into the locket and trusted it to his daughter's keeping. And now, by a near miracle, in the very hour her enemies had tried to take it from her, she had found it. She read it through once, and her hand shook, and she read it again, and then Rosamond Vale, who had not wept at her own disgrace, who had stood among the candles and let them call her a thief without a single tear, sat alone in her cold room with her father's words in her hands, and at last, very quietly, she cried, not from grief, but from the unbearable, long-delayed relief of being told, by the one person who had truly loved her, that she had been right all along to believe herself worth more than the world had ever allowed. The letter was short, for her father had written it in haste and in fear. It told her that he was dying, that he had known it some months, and that he had discovered, too late to mend it in life, a thing done to him by his own brother. It told her that the estate was not ruined, that the debts spoken of were small, and the lands were rich, and that the whole story of his poverty had been built, deed by forged deed, by the brother who stood to inherit if Rosamond could be made to seem a pauper not worth fighting for. It told her that the true deeds, the proofs, the record of what had been stolen, existed still and could be found. And it told her, in the last cramped lines where the hand grew weak, where to begin to look, a name, a place, a man in London who held what her father had not dared to keep in the house. And it told her, at the very end, in words she would carry the rest of her life, that he was sorry, that he had been a foolish, trusting man who saw the wickedness of his own blood too late, and that his only comfort in dying was that he had hidden the truth where only love would think to look for it, and that he believed, he had to believe, that his daughter would one day be both clever enough and loved enough to find it. Rosamond pressed the worn paper to her lips. The candle had burned to a guttering stub, and the cold of the room had crept into her bones, and outside the small window, the spring dark was absolute. But for the first time in 6 years, Rosamond Vale did not feel poor. She had been right. There was something in the locket worth more than diamonds. It was the truth, and her father had left it to her, and the woman who had tried so hard to take it from her had failed by the breadth of a single careless moment. She refolded the paper and fitted it back beneath the false oval, and pressed the seam closed, and she fastened the locket once more beneath her collar, against her own heart, where her mother had carried it, and her father had hidden his last gift. "Guard the locket," the scarred lord had written. "Tell no one you have it." She understood now, far better than he could know, exactly what she was guarding. And she understood, too, that she could not do this alone. The proofs were in London. She had no money to travel, no standing to demand a solicitor's time, no power in all the world but a folded paper and a name. But there was a man who had looked into the same darkness and seen the same shape moving in it, a man with money and standing and a cold, relentless mind, a man who had told her, before 40 witnesses, that he believed her. She had been taught all her life to want less, to expect less, to ask for nothing. She had been taught that needing help was the same as being weak, and that being weak was the same as being lost. But she was beginning to suspect that this lesson, like so many others, had been pressed upon her by people who profited from her solitude, and that there was a difference, a great and freeing difference, between the asking that begs and the asking that two strong people do as equals, and she had not finished forming the thought before the danger she had only suspected made itself plain. It came 2 evenings later, in a way she had not foreseen and would not forget. She was at the top of the house, in the cold blue dusk, when she heard a horse on the gravel below, and then, after an interval, a soft, urgent knock at her own door. Not her aunt's heavy tread, not her uncle's, but something furtive. She opened it to find the footman boy from the dinner, the frightened one who had carried the silver tray, his white face whiter still in the dim light of the passage, his cap twisted in his hands. He should not have been in that part of the house at all, and the risk he had taken in coming was written in every line of him. "Miss," he whispered, "I oughtn't to be here, but I couldn't not. There's a man come from the Price house, in the kitchen now, talking low with the master. I heard it through the scullery. He's asking after a locket, miss. Your locket. He says her ladyship will pay handsomely to have it back. Quiet. No questions. And the master—" The boy swallowed. "The master said he'd see what could be done. They mean to take it from you, miss. Tonight. Or soon. I heard him say it plain." Rosamond stood very still. So she had been right. The locket was the true prize, and Lady Hester, having failed to seize it in the chaos of the dinner, had not given up, but only changed her method, sending an agent with money to buy from a greedy uncle what malice had failed to steal. The trap she had thought sprung was being reset. "Why do you tell me this?" she asked the boy gently. "You put yourself in danger." He looked down at his twisted cap, and then, with the simple courage of the young, back up at her. "Because they made me carry the tray, miss," he said. "I didn't know what was in it till the lid came off, and then it was too late, and I've not slept right since. I saw your face when the word was said. A person doesn't look like that if they done it. I knew it then, and I know it now, and I'll not stand by and let them rob you twice." It was the second time a stranger had told Rosamond that he believed her, and it came, this time, not from a lord with power to spare, but from a frightened boy with nothing to gain and everything to lose. And it moved her more than she could say. She thanked him, and pressed his hand, and sent him quietly back to his place before he should be missed. And then, she did the only safe thing. She did not leave the locket in her room that night, nor any night after. She wore it always now, beneath her collar, against her skin, where no hand could reach it without her knowing, and she lay awake in the dark, with her fingers closed over it, and understood that the Cold War for her name had entered a new and more dangerous season. She could not stay in this house. The locket was no longer safe under her uncle's roof, and neither, she was beginning to think, was she. If Lady Hester would pay to buy the locket back, she would pay for worse, and the uncle had already shown that he would sell anything, even his own brother's child, for the right price. She had to act, and quickly, and she could not do it alone. And there was only one person in all the world who had looked into this darkness and seen what she saw. She took out a sheet of her own thin paper, and she trimmed a fresh candle, and she sat a long while choosing her words. And then, Rosamond Vale, for the first time in her adult life, wrote a letter asking for help. Not pleading, not groveling, but plainly, the way one ally writes to another. "My lord," she began, "you told me to guard the locket. I have done more than guard it. I have opened it and found what was hidden inside, and I believe I now understand why a woman of great fortune took such pains to ruin a girl of none. The answer is not what either of us supposed, and it is larger. I cannot tell it in a letter, and I cannot pursue it alone, for it lies in London, and I have no means to go there. You said you would bring me your answer, and let me do with it what I would. I find I must ask the same of you in return, and to ask is not a thing I am accustomed to. But I have stolen nothing, my lord, and I am done being robbed. Come if you will, and I will show you what my father left me. Yours, no longer quite so alone, Rosamond Vale. She sealed it, and she sent it down with the morning's post before her courage could fail her. And then she sat in her cold room with her hand at the locket and waited, and the waiting was the longest of her life. He came the next afternoon. She heard the carriage from her high window, heard the unfamiliar weight of good horses on the gravel, the murmur below, the sudden flurry of the household as it registered who had come. And she came down the great staircase with her chin level, and the locket warm at her throat, into a hall where her uncle stood grey-faced, and her aunt fluttered, and Lord Aldous Marlowe waited by the cold hearth, with his hat in his hands, and the scar stark in the grey afternoon light. He looked up as she descended, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the household watched them with naked astonishment, because whatever they had expected the Cole lord to want with their disgraced niece, the plain respect with which he inclined his head to her was not it. "Miss Vale," he said. "My lord," she said. "I have received your letter," he said, "and I have had one of my own, from London. I think," and here he glanced at her uncle, who had gone the color of tallow, "I think we had better speak privately." They were given the small, cold parlor, because no one in that house had the courage to refuse the Viscount Greywater anything, and the door was closed, and for the first time since the betrothal dinner, Rosamond Vale and the man who had risen to defend her stood alone in a room together. She did not waste the moment. She drew the locket from beneath her collar, and she warmed the seam with her thumb as she had learned to do, and she opened the false oval and drew out her father's letter and held it out to him. And she watched his scarred face as he read it, watched the hard control of it tighten, and then, by degrees, fill with something that in another man she might have called fury, but in him was quieter and more dangerous. The cold, settled anger of a just man looking at proof of an injustice. He read it twice, as she had. Then he looked up, and he said, very low, "Your uncle." "My uncle," she agreed. "And Lady Hester?" "I do not yet know how she comes into it," said Rosamond. "But she does. No woman builds so careful a trap for a stranger's sake. She wanted something the ruin of me would buy her, and I think it is the same thing my uncle wanted, all those years ago. I think they are in it together, and have been a long time." Aldous was silent a moment. Then he drew from his own coat a letter, and he handed it to her, and it was from the London solicitor, Mr. Quill, and it confirmed in dry legal language what her father had written in love and fear, that the estate of the late Mr. Vale had been encumbered by debts that the record could not substantiate, that the deeds transferring the land to the brother bore signatures a careful eye might question, and that there existed, in the keeping of a firm her father had named, a sealed packet deposited by the late Mr. Vale himself, to be opened only by his daughter or her lawful representative, the contents unknown, but the existence certain. He hid the truth in two places, Aldous said. The thread, in your locket, where only love would look, and the proof, in London, where only the law could keep it safe. He was a clever man, your father, at the last, cleverer than the men who robbed him gave him credit for. He was a trusting man, who learned cleverness too late to save himself, said Rosamond, but not, perhaps, too late to save me. She looked up at the tall, scarred man in the cold parlor, and she made herself say the thing that was hard to say. My lord, I cannot go to London alone, and I cannot claim that packet alone, and I have no money, and no standing, and no name that anyone will honor. You have all three. I am asking for your help, not as a beggar, but as a person who has been wronged and means to set it right, and cannot do it without a hand stronger than her own. I do not know what I can offer you in return." And Lord Aldous Marlowe, who had told her at the betrothal dinner, that the offer of his name would stand, whether she was believed or not, looked at her for a long moment in the gray light, and then he said the thing that she would remember as the moment she first understood what kind of man he truly was. "You have offered me nothing, and you owe me nothing, and that is precisely why I will help you," he said. "I have had a great deal in my life given to me with a price attached. I find I would rather, for once, give a thing freely. I will take you to London. I will see that packet opened, and whatever it contains, the choice of what to do with it will be yours and yours alone. To prosecute or to forgive, to claim your fortune or to walk away from it, to accept my hand at the end of it, or to refuse it and never see me again. I will not bind you with my help. A name is not so easily taken, Miss Vale. Neither is a life. Let us go and take yours back." And Rosamond Vale, standing in a cold parlor in a house that had never loved her, with her father's truth in her hand and an unlooked-for ally at her side, felt the great machine that had been built to crush her shudder for the first time and begin, very slowly, to turn the other way. They went to London. It was arranged with a speed and a delicacy that Rosamond, who had never in her life had means or power at her disposal, found almost dizzying. Aldous did not steal her away or compromise her. He was far too careful of her name for that, and far too aware of how a single misstep would be used against her. He arranged for an elderly cousin of his own, a stern and respectable widow named Mrs. Ferrars, who owed him a kindness and asked no questions, to travel with them as Rosamond's chaperone, so that not even Lady Hester's malice could make of the journey anything improper. And so it was three of them who set out in the gray dawn: the scarred lord, the disgraced girl, and the silent, watchful widow, leaving behind a household that did not dare to forbid it, and did not understand it, and would spend the following weeks in a fever of speculation and dread. The road to London was long, and the days of it gave Rosamond and Aldous something they had not had before: time and proximity, and the slow unspooling of conversation that two careful people permit themselves only when there is nowhere else to look but at each other. They did not speak, at first, of anything that mattered. They spoke of the road, the weather, the inns, the indifferent food. But the country rolled by, mile after mile at the steady 8 or 9 miles in an hour that good horses could keep, and the silences between them grew easier. And by the second day, they had begun, without either quite deciding to tell each other the truth. He told her about the scar. She had not asked. She would never have asked. But on the second evening, in the private parlor of a coaching inn, with Mrs. Ferrars dozing by the fire, and a single lamp between them on the table, Rosamond had looked at the long, pale seam in the lamplight a moment too long, and Aldous had said without rancor, "A bolting carriage, a child in its path. I pulled him clear, and the wheel did the rest." Rosamond was quiet a moment. "They say it was a duel," she said. "I know what they say. Why do you let them?" He turned the lamp a fraction so that the scar fell into shadow, and then, deliberately, turned it back. "Because a man with a duelist's scar is left alone," he said, "and I wanted to be left alone. I learned, some years ago, what it costs to be seen. I had a name once, Miss Vale, a good one, and I trusted it to people who unmade it in an afternoon, for their own advantage, exactly as Lady Hester unmade yours. I was too proud to fight the lie. I thought my silence was dignity. I have come to think it was only fear, wearing dignity's coat." He looked at her across the small lamplit table. "When I saw you stand at that dinner and refuse to weep, I thought you were braver than I had ever been. You stood. I only ever walked away." It was the most he had said about himself, and Rosamond understood the cost of it, and she answered it with a truth of her own. "I did not feel brave," she said. "I felt that if I wept, I would be giving them the last thing I owned. I have learned to keep very little, my lord. I was not going to give them that." And so it went, by lamplight, in coaching inns, the two of them trading the small, hard truths of their lives the way other people traded pleasantries. And Rosamond found, to her own quiet astonishment, that the more she knew of him, the less frightening he became, and that the coldness the world so feared was not coldness at all, but a kind of grief held very still, and that beneath it was a man more principled, more gentle, and more lonely than anyone who flinched from his scarred face would ever trouble to discover. She did not let herself name what was happening. She was too cautious for that, and the stakes were too high, and besides, she had a fortune to reclaim, and a name to clear, and an enemy to face, and there was no room in any of it for the soft, dangerous warmth that crept into her chest when he turned the lamp to show her his scar rather than hide it. But she felt it, and she suspected, from the new care in his silences, and the way his eyes found her across every room, that he felt it too, and that both of them were doing the same brave, foolish thing, refusing to hope, while hoping anyway. London, when they reached it, was vast and loud and gray, and Rosamond had never seen anything like it. They went to the offices of the firm her father had named, Mr. Quill's firm, and there, in a paneled room that smelled of dust and sealing wax, an old solicitor with kind, tired eyes brought out a packet that had lain untouched for 16 years. It was bound in faded ribbon and sealed with her father's seal, and across the front, in the same fine, slanting hand she had found in the locket, was written, "For my daughter Rosamond, when she is old enough to be wronged, and clever enough to be right, Mr. Quill cut the seal." And the truth of what had been done to Rosamond Vale, the whole of it at last, spilled out across the paneled table in deeds and letters, and a dying man's careful account. And it was worse than she had imagined. And it was also, in the end, her salvation. The estate had been worth a great deal. Her father had been, at his death, a wealthy man, the master of broad lands and a fine house, and Rosamond his only child and rightful heir. But her father had also been a trusting man, and an ailing one, and in the last years of his life he had leaned upon his younger brother for the management of his affairs, and his brother, Rosamond's uncle, the cold gray man in whose house she had been raised a pauper, had used that trust to rob her blind, before she was old enough to know she had been robbed. The deeds in the packet showed it plainly. There were two sets. There were the true deeds, recording the estate as it truly stood, rich and nearly unencumbered. And there were the forged ones, the false record her uncle had built, recording vast debts that had never been incurred, and a transfer of the lands to himself in settlement of them. Her father had discovered the forgery only at the very end, too weak to fight it, and he had done the one thing left to a dying man with a child to protect. He had gathered the proof and deposited it where the law would guard it, and hidden the key to it, the knowledge of its existence, in the one place his treacherous brother would never think to look, the locket about his daughter's neck. And he had died, and the lie had stood, and Rosamond had grown up believing herself poor, because the truth had been waiting 16 years for her to be old enough to claim it. But that was only half, for tucked among her father's papers was a thing he could not have foreseen, a thing that made sense at last of the betrothal dinner, and the planted diamond, and the cold, smiling cruelty of Lady Hester Price. It was a letter, not from her father, but to him, in another hand, a woman's hand, dated in the last year of his life, and it was signed with a name Rosamond knew, Hester. Mr. Quill read it aloud, in his dry, careful voice, and the room grew very still as its meaning came clear. For Lady Hester Price, it transpired, had not always been Lady Hester Price. Before her grand marriage, before her wealth, and her position, and her narrow, watchful eyes, she had been a young woman of small means and large ambition, and she had been, for a brief season long ago, the object of the late Mr. Vale's affection, and he of hers. The letter was a love letter, of a kind, a letter of reproach and appeal, written by a younger Hester to the man who had chosen in the end to marry Rosamond's mother instead of her. It spoke of promises she believed he had made. It spoke of money she believed she was owed, and in its last bitter lines, it spoke of a thing that turned Rosamond cold to hear. A threat, made years before it was carried out, that one day, by one means or another, she would have from his blood what his blood had denied her. Rosamond sat very still in the paneled room and understood at last the whole of it. It had never been only about the money, though the money was real. Her uncle had robbed her for greed, but Lady Hester had ruined her for something older and darker and more human, for a wound 30 years deep, for a love refused and a slight never forgiven, for the cold, patient hatred of a proud woman who had been passed over and had waited a lifetime to be revenged upon the one living piece of the man who had passed her over. And somewhere along the years, the greedy uncle and the vengeful spurned woman had found each other, had recognized in each other a shared interest in the erasure of Rosamond Vale, and had made, in the quiet way such people do, a bargain. The uncle would keep the stolen estate. Lady Hester would have her revenge, dressed as a marriage and undone as a disgrace, and the girl between them, the inconvenient living proof of an old defeat, would be ground quietly to nothing, never knowing why. "She meant me to marry her son," Rosamond said slowly, "so that she might have me in her house, in her power, where she could ruin me at leisure, and at the moment of her choosing. The betrothal was never meant to last. It was meant to deliver me to her. And the locket—" She stopped. Her hand rose to it. The locket was the one thing she could not control. She knew my father had hidden something. This letter proves she suspected it for years. She did not know what or where, but she feared it. And so the diamond, the accusation, it was two schemes in one. To ruin me before the world, yes, but also, in the confusion, to take the locket from me, to get her hands at last on the one object my father had warned her, in some letter she never let him finish, held the truth that could undo them both. She looked up at Aldous, and her dark eyes were bright and steady, and she failed, by the breadth of a single moment, in the chaos she herself had made. She let me take it back, the whole of her revenge, 30 years in the planning, and she lost it, because in the one instant that mattered, she was watching my face, instead of my hands. Aldous looked at her across the paneled table, and there was something in his scarred face she had not seen there before, something that was admiration, and was also, though neither of them would name it yet, a great deal more. "Careful people," he said quietly, "always make their one mistake exactly where they are most careful. She was so careful to be seen ruining you that she forgot to keep the thing she was truly after. What will you do, Miss Vale? You hold proof enough now to send your uncle to prison, and Lady Hester with him. You can have the estate restored, every acre, and your name cleared before the same society that condemned you, and your enemies destroyed as thoroughly as they meant to destroy you. The law will give you all of it. You have only to ask." And there it was, the choice her father had promised her, the choice Aldous had sworn would be hers and hers alone. To prosecute, or to forgive, to claim, or to walk away, to answer cruelty with ruin, or to find, somewhere in herself, a harder and stranger thing. Rosamond was quiet a long moment. She thought of the cold room at the top of the house. She thought of 6 years of being made small. She thought of the word falling into the hush of the dinner, and the candle guttering, and the diamond glittering where her mother's face had been. She thought of how badly, how richly, they deserved to suffer. And then she thought of her father's last words, hidden in the locket, that his only comfort in dying was that he had hidden the truth where only love would think to look. He had not, she realized, left her the locket to make her rich. He had left it to make her free. And freedom, real freedom, was not the same as revenge. "I will reclaim what is mine," she said at last, slowly, feeling her way toward the shape of it. "Every acre, I will not leave my father's land in the hands of the man who stole it, nor let the lie of my poverty stand a day longer than it must. That is justice, and I will have it. But as for the rest—" She paused. "I do not yet know. I will not decide it here, in anger, in a dusty room. My father chose love over revenge in the way he hid the truth. I should like, when this is done, to be able to say I did the same. Let me reclaim my name and my land, the fate of the two who took them. That, I think, I will decide when I can do it with a clear heart, and not before." Mr. Quill, the old solicitor, looked at her over his spectacles with something like respect. "Spoken," he said, "like your father's daughter." And Aldous Marlowe said nothing at all, but he looked at her across the table in the dusty London light, and Rosamond saw in his face that whatever distant guarded thing he had buried 10 years before had, in that moment, finally and irrevocably, stirred. The return from London was not the same journey as the going. They had set out 3 strangers bound by a puzzle. They came back something else, something neither of them had words for, and both were afraid to name. The proof was secured. Mr. Quill, on Aldous' surety, had set the law in motion with the quiet speed that money and standing command, and even now the machinery that would restore Rosamond's estate and expose the forgery was grinding into motion. Rosamond Vale was no longer a penniless, disgraced girl. She was, though the world did not yet know it, a considerable heiress with the law on her side, and proof in a solicitor's strong-box, and the knowledge of it sat strangely on her, like a coat cut for someone else, that she would have to grow into. But it was not the fortune that occupied her thoughts on the long road home. It was the man across the carriage from her, who had given her all of this, and asked for nothing, and who would, she knew, hold to his word, and let her walk away from him at the end of it, if she chose, and never reproach her, and never reveal what it had cost him. They stopped, on the last night before they reached the country, at the same coaching inn where Aldous had first shown her his scar. It seemed a long time ago. Mrs. Ferrers, the stern, kind widow, had grown fond of Rosamond over the journey, and she took herself off to bed early with a knowing look that fooled no one, and left the two of them alone in the small parlor with the fire and the single lamp, as she had left them on the way out. And Rosamond understood that the old woman was giving them, deliberately, the thing that 2 careful people would never have taken for themselves. For a long while, neither spoke. The fire settled. The lamp burned steady. Outside, a soft spring rain had begun, and it whispered against the dark window, and Rosamond thought of all the cold rooms of her life, and how few of them had ever held a fire, and a friend at once. "You will be restored within the month," Aldous said at last. "Quill is certain of it. Your uncle will not dare contest the true deeds. He knows what they prove, and what the alternative is. You will have your name and your land. You will be, Miss Vale, a woman of independent fortune, which is to say, a woman who need answer to no one, and ask nothing of anyone, ever again." "I know," she said. "And I find," he went on, with the careful slowness of a man choosing each word as he set it down, "that I must say to you now the thing I have been at pains not to say, because it would be unjust to say it before you were free, and I would not for the world have you mistake gratitude for anything else. You are free now, or near enough, and so I may tell you, without the weight of obligation crushing it, that the offer I made you at that dinner, the offer of my name, my hand, my protection, was never only the just gesture I pretended it was. I made it because in the hour I knew you, I had come to want, more than I have wanted anything in 10 cold years, the chance to know you longer." He looked at her steadily, the scar stark in the lamplight, and he did not turn it away. "I am not an easy man, nor a warm one, nor one the world finds anything to envy. I have a name half the county still whispers about, and a face that frightens children. I can offer you no advantage you cannot now buy for yourself. I can offer you only myself, such as I am, and the certain knowledge that I would spend the rest of my life ensuring that no one ever again made you feel small in a bright and crowded room. That is the whole of it. You owe me nothing, and I will hold you to nothing. And if you tell me to take you home and trouble you no further, I will do it, and wish you every happiness, and never speak of this again." A brief silence. 1 second. 2 seconds. The rain whispered at the window, and Rosamond Vale, who had been taught all her life to want less, to expect less, to keep very little so that very little could be taken. Rosamond Vale looked at the scarred and lonely man who had crossed a hostel room to stand beside her when she had nothing, and who was offering her now, with such painful care, a thing she had never once let herself believe she might have, and she found that the long discipline of her wanting had finally, blessedly, failed her. She did not want less. For the first time in her life, she wanted everything, and she was no longer afraid to say so. "When you rose at that dinner," she said slowly, "you said you did not need the room to believe me. You said you believed me yourself, and that was enough. Do you know, my lord, that no one had told me they believed me in 6 years? Not my uncle. Not the man I was to marry. Not one soul in all the cold rooms I have lived in. You were the first. You stood up in a room full of people who hate and fear you, for a girl you had known an hour, with nothing to gain by it, and you told the truth out loud, because it was the truth. I have thought about it every day since." She rose from her chair, and she came around the small table, and she stood before him, and she did the thing she had wanted to do since the second evening of their journey. She reached up, slowly, and she laid her hand against the scarred side of his face, the side he showed the world to frighten it, the side he had turned toward her in the lamplight as a kind of test. He went very still beneath her touch. "You think this is the worst of you," she said softly. "It is the best. It is the mark of the one time you did not walk away. I should be glad to look at it every day for the rest of my life." His hand came up and covered hers, and his eyes, when she met them, were not cold at all. "Rosamond," he said, her name, her own name, said for the first time without title or distance, said the way one says a thing one has wanted a long time to say. "Aldous," she answered, "and the cold lord no one had dared to marry, and the girl they had called a thief, stood together in the small lamplit parlor with the spring rain whispering at the window, and the long, careful distance between them at last fell away, and neither of them, that night, said anything more, because some things do not need to be said, and the silence between two people who have stopped being afraid is the warmest silence there is. There remained the matter of justice, and the reckoning of those who had done the wrong, and the public clearing of a name that had been so publicly taken. It came some weeks later, and it came with a fitting symmetry that Rosamond did not arrange, but did not refuse, at a gathering of nearly the same society that had watched her fall. It was not a betrothal dinner this time. It was a great assembly, a county ball thrown by a family eager to be seen entertaining the newly restored Miss Vale and the Viscount Greywater, for the story had broken now, the whole astonishing story, and society, which had been so eager to call her a thief, was now equally eager to have been her secret champion all along. The forged deeds had been exposed. The true estate had been restored. Mr. Quill's strong box had given up its proofs to a magistrate, and the law had moved as the law moves when fortune and standing push it. And Rosamond Vale was once again, and publicly, the heiress she had always secretly been. She came to the ball on Aldous' arm, in a gown that was hers, and not borrowed, a deep midnight silk that became her dark hair, and at her throat, where it had always belonged, hung her mother's locket, its false oval closed now over an emptiness. For the paper that had lived inside it 16 years had done its work and been retired to safety, and the locket held once more only her mother's faded portrait, restored to its place. She walked into the blazing ballroom on the arm of the cold lord, and the candles caught the locket at her throat, and the whispers ran down the room as they had once run down a dinner table. But they were different whispers now, and Rosamond, who had walked into a hostile room once before with her chin level and her hands still, walked into this one exactly the same way, and found that dignity worn in triumph felt very like dignity worn in disgrace, and was glad she had practiced it. Lady Hester Price was there. That was the thing Rosamond had known would come and had steeled herself for. The woman's own ruin was not yet complete. The law grinds slowly, and the full account of her part was still being drawn up. But the story had spread, and society, which forgives many things, but never being on the losing side, had already begun to turn from her. She stood near the edge of the great room, no longer at the head of any table, watched now herself, with the sidelong cruelty she had once directed at others. And when she saw Rosamond enter on the arm of the Viscount Greywater, restored and radiant and untouchable, something in her proud face crumpled, and then, with a terrible effort, reassembled itself into composure. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and Rosamond, who could have cut her dead, who could have had her thrown out, who held in a solicitor's strongbox the power to send her to prison and to ruin, did a thing that surprised the whole watching room, and surprised most of all Lady Hester. She crossed the floor to her. The crowd parted. The whispers stilled. Even the musicians seemed to play more softly. Rosamond Vale walked the length of the ballroom to the woman who had called her a thief, and she stopped before her. And for a long moment the two women looked at each other, the young one restored, the old one falling, the wound 30 years deep open at last between them. "You wanted something from my father that he could not give you," Rosamond said very quietly, so that only Hester could hear. "And you spent your life turning that wanting into hatred, and you aimed the hatred at me, who never wronged you, who never even knew you. I have read your letter. I know what was done to you, and I know it was real, and I am sorry for the girl you were, who was passed over and never forgave it." She paused. Lady Hester's face had gone white and rigid, braced for the blow. "But I am not sorry enough to let you keep what you stole, nor to spare you what the law will do. The estate is mine again. The forgery is proven. That much is justice, and justice I will have. What I will not do," and here Rosamond's voice dropped lower still, "is become you. I will not spend my life nursing a wound until it poisons everything I touch. You taught me, this past month, exactly what that costs. So I will take back what is mine, and I will let the law do what it must, and then I will close the door on you, Lady Hester, and I will not think of you again. That is not mercy. It is freedom. And it is the one thing you cannot take from me, and the one thing, I think, you never had." And then Rosamond Vale turned, without waiting for an answer, because there was no answer that mattered, and she walked back across the silent ballroom to the man who waited for her, and she did not look back, and the locket caught the candlelight at her throat as she went. The room let out its breath. Somewhere the music swelled again, and Lady Hester Price stood alone at the edge of a brightness she no longer belonged to. Undone, not by cruelty, answered with cruelty, but by the far worse thing of being at last simply set down and walked away from, like a weight one has finally decided not to carry. Aldous took Rosamond's hand as she reached him. "You could have destroyed her," he said quietly. "I did," said Rosamond, "just not the way she would have understood. She thought then that she would tell you, if you were the kind of listener who stays to the end of a hard story to see whether the wronged are made whole. She thought she would tell you that the law did its work in the months that followed, that the forged deeds sent her uncle to answer for his theft and stripped him of the comfort he had built on her loss, that Lady Hester's part was harder to prove, but impossible to hide, and that the woman ended her days in a diminished and whispered about retirement, which was its own kind of justice, the justice of a proud creature outliving her own importance. But Rosamond did not stay to watch it. She had reclaimed her name, and her land, and her father's good memory, and having reclaimed them, she found she had no appetite to stand over the punishment of those who had taken them, and so she let the law be the law, and she turned, with a deliberateness that was the truest measure of her healing, toward the life she meant to build instead. 2 years later, on a soft evening in early summer, there was a candle burning in the window of a fine old house set among broad green lands, the house that had been her father's, and was hers again, restored stone by stone and acre by acre to what it had been before the lie. Rosamond stood at that window with the candle beside her, looking out over the lands that were truly hers, and at her throat, as always, hung her mother's locket, warm against her heart. She was Lady Greywater now. She had married Aldous Marlowe in the spring of the year after London, in a small chapel with only Mrs. Ferrars, and old Mr. Quill, and a handful of true friends to see it. And she had married him not because she needed him, for she needed no one now, but because she wanted him, freely, the way her father had wanted her mother, with the whole of a heart that had finally been allowed to want. The house behind her was warm and full of light. She could hear, distantly, the sound of her husband's voice in another room, low and even, reading aloud to no one in particular in the way he had taken up since happiness had made him, against all his old habits, a man who sometimes spoke, just for the pleasure of being heard. She thought of the betrothal dinner, as she still sometimes did. She thought of the word falling into the hush, and the candle guttering, and the locket on the silver tray, with a stranger's diamond glittering where her mother's face had been. She'd been so alone in that bright, cruel room, so certain that her name had been taken from her past, all reclaiming. And she lifted her hand now to the locket at her throat, and she opened the false oval, empty now, its secret long since spent and safe. And she looked at her mother's restored portrait, the woman with her own dark eyes, who had once said there was something in it worth more than diamonds. And Rosamond understood at last that her mother had been right twice over. There had been the truth, worth more than diamonds, that had set her free. And there was this, the closing of the loop, the loss turned to belonging, the name not taken after all, but kept and grown, and made her own past any power on earth to take again. She had carried this locket as a poor girl who owned nothing. She wore it now as a woman who owned herself. The candle burned steady in the window, the same small, honest light that had guttered once in a hall full of cruelty and burned low over a hidden letter and shown her, in the dark of her cold room, her father's saving words. It did not gutter now. It burned warm, and even in the window of her own house, on her own land, in a life she had reclaimed with her own 2 hands and a single folded paper, and the help of a man who had loved her enough to ask for nothing. A name is not so easily taken. She had set it once into a hostile silence, as a wound and a defiance, a thing she had needed to believe and had not been sure of. She said it now to herself, softly, at the window, and it was not a wound any more, and it was not a defiance. It was simply true. They had named her a thief, and she had taken nothing, and in the end, she had been given everything, and the difference between the two, between what is taken and what is freely given, between the asking that begs and the asking that loves, was the whole of what she had learned, and the whole of what she had become. So I will leave you here, by the warm window with the steady candle, and ask you only this, before you go. When the world names you wrongly, as one day in some bright, crowded room it surely will you spend your life proving them wrong? Or will you spend it, as she finally did, simply living so well and so freely that the wrong name can find no purchase and falls away of its own weight? There's a kind of vindication that answers cruelty with cruelty, and there is a kind that answers it with a life well built and a door quietly closed, and only you can know which one will let you sleep. That was tonight's chapter, from Candlelit Chapters. If her story moved you, snuff the candle gently, and tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight, and whether you think she chose rightly when she chose freedom over revenge. Stay a while in the quiet, and join me when the candle is lit again for the next